Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Anthony Moray.
Is this on? I don't think the mic's on. Can you guys hear? Oh, sweet. Well, thank you for coming. My name's Anthony Moore, of course, as you know. Our faces are much bigger than I thought they'd be, but welcome to the Architectural VR, the Hidden Giant. We're going to be talking about the kind of uses of architectural VR and how they found their way into our discipline and why we're interested in them. I'm personally the director of the A+D Museum in Los Angeles, and we've been very interested in understanding how we can start to understand this tech, both as an inspiration for reality, how it finds its way into culture, and how we can start representing culture in our own realm. A lot of the people that are here today are going to approach it from different perspectives and from different ideas of how to invigorate, integrate, develop, and construct realities, both from the professional realm, from the inspirational realm, creative realm, and conceptual realm. And so today we have 4 panelists that are going to be sitting with us. The first one is Kili Koklu. She runs Kilograph. She's a creator of pretty much everything fantastical that comes out between VR, illustration, and is the hidden voice behind a lot of the beautiful work that you see out there today. Say hi. Second one is Lon Groves. He's from Chaos Group, a VP of Strategic Marketing. And he's also the president of the American, let me get this right, Society of Architectural Illustrators. Gotta say all that, good. Well, wait, say hello.
Hi.
Karenza Harris, she's the director of design technology at Morphosis, and also a faculty at SciArc here in LA, which I see some of you probably already know her from there. And John Sangiovanni pretty much blew all of our minds about 5 minutes ago backstage with his tech. Sadly, you won't be able to experience it here today, but he's founder and CEO of Visual Vocal, kind of finding amazing ways for collaborative efforts between construction, VR, experiences, and how to kind of start creating a cross-platform collaborative effort with all the crazy stuff we're making today. And that's the 4 panelists. Start with the questions. So what's interesting today about the group that we have is that they're going to be approaching it from pretty dynamic different points of views, but kind of with the centered effort of the medium that we're going to be discussing. It's a medium that, for all intents and purposes, has been adapted radically fast, very successfully, very much unlike other mediums that were kind of finding their way into the discipline at that time, which has somewhat turned VR and now architecture seems like a perfect platform. It's really turned it into a success story within the architecture realm, construction realm, and the design realm. What do you think with architecture and why architecture was it so successful and how did it move forward? And I think each one of you could probably have a different perspective on that, but we'll start in order so we can kind of get everyone involved for a couple of minutes. But I think it'd be great to hear from a software side, from a production and visualization side, from being able to take projects from Pritzker Prize winning architects to the final stages, to saying you guys don't know what you're doing, let me show you how you can do it better, kind of approach. Why architecture took to it so well. Pick one.
Well, I can jump in there. I think architecture is an inherently spatial medium, and when we heard about the early days of virtual reality, sort of filmmaking, a lot of the challenges had to do with how do you insert a narrative into a 360-degree environment. And architecture is inherently, the story is the space. So we think in 360 degrees, we think spatially, and being able to communicate your design spatially is really the original use case for VR in architecture.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it boils down to kind of one thing that you can't take away from VR and architecture no matter what, and that is scale, right? So from the beginning of time, architects have worked in miniature, right? Like we've drawn on paper, we've made scale models, we've looked at things on computer screens, so everything gets confined into miniature, And now we have this superpower, this ability to get beyond that and start to experience things at true scale, one-to-one scale, in an efficient way. And to me, that's the one thing, the one ingredient that you can't take away from it is this new superpower.
Yeah, I mean, the methodology that we use to kind of design space, design experiences in my office is kind of a frenetic energy of, quick iteration, exploration of form, spaces, program, and we've experimented with kind of the VR immersive environment, which is kind of quite easy to get into, right? You don't need any specific kind of skills to get in. You just install it, you have it there, and it's fully integrated with our 3D modeling software. So we have a kind of an easy back and forth between, our 3D digital models and the actual experience of the full-scale model that you could potentially inhabit in VR. But what we've also been very interested in, and I guess the next few years are going to kind of be a proof of concept a little bit, is to integrate it in a design process. So not necessarily kind of an immediate kind of manipulation of form through the software, but we use it for prototyping, mock-up, simulation, things that we are very kind of aware of, and we have a kind of an expertise that allows us to anticipate some of these things. But sometimes the models of kind of simulation, for example, or analysis are so complex that we need to find ways to deconstruct it. So we'll find a variety of strategies that could be kind of like prototyping, like 3D model, physical modeling, printing, and things like that. But then the immersive world is for us one way to start to access these kind of strategies using more than vision. Now, obviously, now we're still at a point where kind of the immediate interaction is very much focused on a visual aspect. But we are already kind of excited about this full immersion, and we can use it to deconstruct spaces and deconstruct experience of space, and kind of build our narrative maybe in a kind of tighter way, and a kind of anticipation for the actual physical build form that we have at the end of the game.
So I am in awe of architects. I'm probably the least architectural person on this panel, although my father was an architect. An interesting dimension of this is my third software venture, and this particular one we took an interesting strategic and structural path, which is that the venture is quite literally co-founded by an architectural studio. So myself and my technical co-founder, Sean B. House, and then NBBJ, large multinational architecture firm, under the leadership of Steve McConnell and others, wanted to participate in the design process. But the cool twist is, unlike other VR tech companies who are focused on really the visualization pipeline or geometry extraction, the reality is that you will always do rendering way better than we will ever do. And there's other companies that will do geometry extraction way better than we'll ever do. So we've decided to focus exclusively on how humans communicate in complex 3D space. So looking at synchronous, asynchronous, messaging, meetings, annotation, markup, variation, decisioneering, all these kind of dimensions of human experience that are relevant to architecture, but also molecular biology and clinical communication, aerospace, automotive, anywhere where they're living and breathing in complex 3D spaces. So why did we choose to partner with an architectural firm instead of an aerospace company or a clinical biology company? And there's two superpowers that architects have that are incredibly special. One is the one you mentioned, which is a fluency with human scale, which is difficult to overstate when we're talking about AR and VR applications. But the second one is an incredible intuition about constraints, understanding exactly what are the right constraints of any presentation, of any communication medium. And so this is the reason why I think architectural adoption of AR and VR tech has been so rapid. It's not just because of the transformative potential of human scale. It's because architects get it, uppercase G, uppercase I, because they've been thinking about storytelling in immersive spaces for thousands of years. So that's why I'm an architectural fanboy, not just because I love buildings, but because I love the way that architects' brains work.
I think personally, as an architect, having 3 times the word superpower used to describe us as beautiful on this panel. I've never seen architects given superpowers before. There's the fellow architects, I guess. Just clap. There's 2 points you guys hit on that I think are worthy of expanding on, and I think it's among more, but the idea that the storytelling aspect of VR, I think, is one, and the unbuilt. I think the process of being able to visualize the unbuilt, what does that mean now for architecture, that we can now actually stand within something in process and see it before it gets there, and what does that mean for the client, what does that mean for the design process, and also what does that mean for the storytelling capabilities of this, that you can now storytell both the process and the object in time in a condensed or expanded version, and how do you see that building up or changing over time? I think we were in the back right now. I'm going to keep saying because it blew us, but you kind of just said, watch this, I'm going to show you a bridge that wasn't going to be there. And we kind of see what the opportunities were, and it looks real. It feels real. And you're bringing in the psychology of the real into the space, even though it's unbuilt, and now it's built for my mind. How do you see that going forward? How do you see that being different than a render that shows you what something could be, where it starts to be something that is? And I think that's something that will possibly change, and I want to hear your feedback on how that changes.
I mean, I would say for our particular kind of design process, we will go to a great extent not to use photorealistic renderings, for example, right? And Kelly's worked with us quite a lot. And every time we visually represent the architecture, it's this mixture of the pragmatic and the poetic, right? Where we have issues of, we use certain materials, the materials behave in a certain way, we have gravity, things that are quite important that we have to somehow deliver on. But then on the kind of other end of the spectrum, there is this kind of ethereal and kind of all-encompassing narrative of that kind of the design of architecture that starts at the inception, the initial idea, and grows and kind of gets fed by all these different, factors and forces that can be physical forces, they can be kind of more like based on social aspects of the city you live in, the immediate context. And at some point, through all these loops that we're doing, we settle on a form, and the form is physically built. And now it is a physical place on Earth, and we've stopped time and we've produced something, right? But then the narrative continues, right? So there is, the kind of the anticipation, the approach, the before you encounter the architecture, which is actually quite important for us, and that changes over time, and that we use at some level, in the way that we design or conceptualize the architecture. And then you experience the architecture, physically experience it, and there's a, you understand it through, perception and awareness, and kind of like a way to translate, what the input into, some kind of emotional response, and then there's the after. And so I think that we never necessarily design space specifically in a way to nudge your body or cause you to do certain things. It has like a bigger picture, a bigger narrative that kind of melds these two things that are quite opposite, the pragmatic and the poetic. I mean, it can be different words, but it's kind of a representation of this kind of artistic and, rational ways of bringing these things together.
I think just to pick up on what Karenza's saying, it's the way that that we encounter some of these different, I'd say, use cases for virtual reality and even two-dimensional visualization. It's very different when you're talking to an architect. There's even when we would talk about 2D renderings or 2D animation, sort of the linear visualization, it's often a conversation of ideas, of concepts, of sort of poetics, as you say, and it's not necessarily the high fidelity. It's sort of a conceptual exercise. And then we talk to, say, the communication side, public communication, to maybe a different audience for development or something like that. It's much more about a kind of literal representation, but sometimes in a more editorial way. So there's not a need to show perhaps the whole building. There's maybe a desire to show a vignette, which is perhaps more talking about a brand, et cetera. But on the virtual reality side, it's really a spatial conversation. So in many ways, it's suited very well to an audience that is not perhaps adept at understanding that kind of architectural narrative. It's an audience that perhaps even has difficulty with two-dimensional renderings. It's about really placing someone inside of an environment once perhaps a lot of the design decisions have been kind of made, and really communicating what that spatial proposition is. So you might have a floor plan that's very small, say 400 square feet, with incredibly high ceilings. That's very difficult to communicate, and then to the conversation of scale, you put someone inside of that environment, and it's an awareness of, oh my goodness, okay. So from architectural design side, I think there's this wonderful creativity that comes from these conversations of everything from the economic consequences of a project to the cultural, historical, different tools that you can use, and VR is one of those tools. But on the sort of public-facing side, we've never seen anything like the adoption that we've seen from communication in VR space. So
I mean, the thing that I'd like to see as a movement, right, is go unbuilt, right? There's this whole new landscape of virtual reality that you can design for, and architects are perfect to design for it. Because I don't know about you, but I've experienced a lot of really crappy VR spaces that I wouldn't want to go in real life, let alone in a headset. Like go to the Netflix lodge and watch a movie, right? It's not good. It's not a great place to be. Sorry, Netflix. But imagine if you could take the restraints of gravity and the restraints of egress and code, and you could really, begin to develop these worlds. Of course, people in visual effects and games and so on, they're already doing that, but I'd love to meet the world's most famous virtual architect, right? And I wish there were people like Lebbeus Woods and so on that were still here that could take that medium to this level where you could elevate it to where environment is this kind of new art form. So to me, there's this idea that the unbuilt could remain unbuilt, and that's where you go in VR.
yeah.
That's cool. There's a little bit of evidence of that in kind of early video game designs, where there was a handful of kind of world-class multiplayer game designers that started to get some name recognition because they had certain characteristics in their levels, and that was sort of the first little evidence of that. But I mean, this is a beautiful narrative in terms of what are all the axes for us to explore in this domain. So there's the real versus the unreal. There's the fidelity of rendering. One of the insights that I had, because again, I have a deep background in interaction architecture and in VR, but I'm new to architecture. So one insight that came late for me, frankly, that's probably obvious to everybody else on this stage, is sort of really grokking what is the content and what is the context of an immersive conversation about space. I think I was probably predisposed to go the obvious route and assume that the building was the content, but it's totally not, right? The content is the conversation around it, and the design intent, and the human, and a lot of that happens in the voice track and the theater of a meeting in the olden days of architecture. But now, that really has focused our attention not on how do you extract the geometries and get them into the space, but actually how do you support all those conversations that happen around and through and in front of the space, and then how do you layer in different characteristics of the space to support the human conversation. And so that was certainly a mind shift for us in our design process a few years ago, when we recognized that it wasn't just about extracting the geometries and looking at the building in VR. It was about creating a framework for the real content, which is the human dialogue around the space.
Yeah,
But
particularly
isn't it more interesting to imagine that what we always assume to be this inactive thing that you throw into the world and it has weight, but it's just as a background? Isn't it more interesting to think about is how do you activate architecture? And so it becomes one of your main character in a narrative that you're trying to do, especially thinking that the kind of the tools that you have at hand in immersive experience allow you to do what we cannot do in our everyday practice, and once we build the architecture. I think it's I think it's a kind of it's a filmmaking, gaming approach to say, everybody is centric, centers around human interaction and human interaction with the environment. And again, earlier today we were kind of told that again, and I would propose that there is ways now and tools where we can flip the narrative and remove a little bit of the agency from the human component and kind of translate that into the architectural environment and make the architecture an active, character part of the narrative, and that the dialogue is not so much centers around human and human interaction, but that it actually kind of floats out and starts to pick up from that other part, right? Which tricky, but we've done it in some ways. But I think this this technology and the way it's now kind of moving forward is starting to give us the tools to do that as an architect, not as a developer or like an expert in the tool, that we are able to kind of use our architectural kind of power to bring those things into play.
Yes. Would you say an architectural superpower?
Yeah.
Sorry. Trying to add to your list.
Yeah.
Keely, did you want to?
Oh, I guess I think I lost what I was saying because what you said was so interesting. But I think adding other senses into the equation, so it's not just about the visual proposition. We're able now to have a complete sensory experience with the ambisonics and even the haptics and, smell, if you've been to the void and you've smelled the burning, whatever that is. I think it creates a complete experience of a space. So that's really interesting.
So considering our gradient that we just learned from Lon on good versus bad is Netflix, and then being the worst, can you explain kind of, I guess amongst all of you, what are some of the obvious pitfalls that are kind of going on right now? I mean, I think we're all I think architects and other superpowers, we're very good at describing our success stories. There's obviously, VR is a safe place for experimentation. It kind of creates that on a level that we've never seen before and on a scale we've never been able to see before. Getting as close to the real before having to stop it and put it there. So what are some of the obvious pitfalls you guys see coming out of this? And what are also the high points? Maybe we can also just jump there a little bit. And how do you think those pitfalls or those high points are changing how we're moving into tomorrow, or how have they affected how we think of architecture moving into tomorrow?
You want to take that on?
I mean, I could kick that off because one of the things that I see as a barrier for this to really take off is that so much of the conversation revolves around tech, right? So until the conversation becomes about what can you do, how can you elevate the experience, how can you communicate, how can you turn this into a medium that does something more than just, it feels like a gimmick or something like that, right? And because every day there's some new tech that we've got to learn and figure out, and we're in this kind of upward cycle of there's a new headset, just trying to set up a Vive, right, is not something for, and my mom's not going to do it. And the idea that as soon as we can get beyond that, then the real conversations start to happen. To me, that's a necessary step for this to move forward.
I definitely agree, and on the design side as well, there's a hesitation to perhaps jumping in because it's a new medium for a lot of people. We seem to put all of our trust in the engineers. This is the correct way to move in space. This is the correct, there are things like frame rate, which you can't really argue with, but I think when it comes to, say, how you interact in those environments, it's more interesting to do things that are wrong, which we learn from rendering and drawing. And those little sort of human acts of creativity make something interesting. And so I think we need to sort of remove, no offense to who's an engineer, because engineering is awesome, and we all need it, especially for big tech, but being able to take some of the control back to do things that are perhaps wrong, I think is a potential pitfall if you can't do that.
One pitfall that we've observed is that there's this crazy kind of intellectual inversion that's happening, where, there's a decades-old, centuries-old dialogue maybe around how a great museum should get out of the way and let the building should get out of the way and let the objects, sort of be celebrated. The objects in the museum, the museum shouldn't distract. And there's much critique about really bonkers museums architecturally that maybe they're actually taking away from the artwork, and I'm not going to have that debate here. I will lose in this audience, but I don't have a point of view. But one thing I observe is that there's this crazy inversion in VR, particularly architectural VR applications, where by nature complex VR interactions require a fair amount of kind of chrome, for lack of a better expression. They require there's a lot of controls that you need in the physical world because you don't have a perimeter, or you need to figure out how to incorporate that into your UI in some way. But the same risk is profound in the sense that the object has a risk to take away from the space that you're immersed in. It's sort of the opposite of the museum problem. So one of our biggest challenges, and I think hopefully we've succeeded, is being extremely understated with the visual style of the user interface itself. Get out of the way, in some cases even remove the user interface altogether to let the work stand out and be celebrated and be the subject of conversation, and make the medium as kind of lightweight as possible. That's a common pitfall that I observe in architectural VR systems that are designed by interaction architects or game designers that are very heavyweight in their own right. So getting out of the way can be hard in that way.
I want to expand on that a little bit, because I think the kind of context and where things sit has become, conceptually, you can kind of see much more now. You can visualize. The context becomes just as important because you need to build it. And it gets really close into if we were to think today about how we think about urban planning and the idea of being able to plan through VR and being able to see cities at a scale that we could never comprehend, being able to drop in anywhere and be able to see it and experience it. And the object becomes scalable, right? At one moment, the object is there, and the next moment, the object is one of many. And the fidelity becomes very important, how you start understanding. So how do you think VR can move forward in a situation where we are taking on urban conditions much stronger in architecture, and that scale has become much more plausible to comprehend the kind of the repercussions of going to that scale? How is VR either working with it or enhancing that opportunity, and what can it get from it, and how can it move forward with it?
Well, I think from a kind of public engagement perspective, VR has an incredible, particularly web VR, has an incredible potential to communicate the future of a city to people within the city. So you can distribute content in a very lightweight and mobile way, allowing people to immerse themselves in, say, a street corner in present day, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and to really understand how a certain urban planning initiative might change their experience of a part of a city. So I think that has a lot of potential.
I was going to say exactly that. Totally agree. That accessibility is the key. Yeah.
Distribution.
But for us, even though we make architecture, we're very much kind of integrated into the kind of urban conversation as well. We have the Now Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that deals with urban, issues of architecture and urban at urban scale. They have, they've been involved in the grand challenges, the 2050 LA, Sustainable LA, and kind of a real kind of application, working with the cities to kind of discuss, the future of architecture, and then the future architecture as an urban, kind of at an urban scale and as an urban component. And so I think that at the base, the way that we kind of compile all these forces that are acting on a space, on a piece of architecture, on a block, on a city, on the country, and the repercussions around the world. All those things are kind of following the same patterns of investigation and methodology, and we're just dealing with a scalable data, a lot more data. And what we found is that we're now technologically competent to mine a lot of quantifiable information and non-quantifiable information. For example, behaviors and movements of crowds, and anticipating, in the future, how these things may interact with more, again, pragmatic aspects of kind of urban scale elements. What we found is that at one point there's a complexity in these systems that is untangleable. I don't know if that's a word, but that our brains cannot untangle, and that for us to be able to kind of see how these systems are interacting together, we need to find other technologies, that will allow us to interpret, analyze, and just understand and make these connections. And so I think that's where AR has come in handy, and we're hoping that in VR we're able to, at this point, kind of visualize these things a little bit better. And that's where I would go in the first place. Obviously, you have a lot of companies now that are doing that, right? They're kind of mining all this data and kind of combining in one way or another. And I think it has like a direct implication in kind of urban strategies today, yesterday, in the next 50, 100 years or more. Yeah.
So, just because you said sorry for bringing it up, and now I have to go back to you, Lon, is the technology side of it. I mean,
Yeah.
Right now we just still can't escape that. It's still
Cannot escape it.
Yeah.
It's being fetishized to the level where it's so
But
much fun.
I have
and
to say that I'm pretty, I have to learn like so many software, but I learn it to a level that allows me to say, I have an idea, what does it take to make it? Do I go to a fabricator and ask him how he's what his expertise is in material and fabrication process? Do I go to a software developer, which we have? We're using 3D Experience, which is the new CATIA V6 on the cloud, and we're working with Dassault system to develop the tools, right? Or do we go to Lon and say, Lon, we have all this information, we want to do this high resolution kind of visualization, or we go to Keeley, we're trying to tell this story, we don't know how to do it. So I think awareness of the technology and a little bit of like enough knowledge so you can ask the right question and understand that there may be tools out there that are architecture industry or not, we don't care, right? We just want to get it done. We get the job done, and how do you get there? So it is about technology, but it's not about becoming an expert in all these. I cannot do it because it's not about becoming an expert in all these things, and it's just finding the resources at hand, which are like already on this panel, we have a few of them, to be able to allow us to kind of do what we're setting out to do in the first place.
Yeah, and then, I think it's up to, folks like John and I to make sure that, one, the technology is doing what you need it to do, but to make it as easy as possible, right, as approachable as it can be, and, as easy as like walking up to the copy machine, hitting the button, right? Like, it should be push button, and that's going to take some time, but I think that's one of the success stories that, we have gotten to a point where I think, 50% of architects that we talk to are already using VR, 2/3 are looking in and going to be using it. They're already rendering, stereo cube maps and things like that as much as they were rendering 2D renders and using that as their dialogue and so on. And then they're also getting fluent with the tools, right? To where, like John takes out his phone, he's got the Google glasses right on it, and it comes out like a switchblade, which is pretty impressive.
That's pretty awesome.
It's kind of
Can you
crazy.
raise your brother?
yeah, this is
Wait
amazing.
for it. 3, 2, 1.
It's so, it's like having it be that accessible and that simple is really, I think, key.
It's critical. It gives you more time for creativity. So the less we have to think about settings and processes, the more we can focus on how to communicate in the most effective way. So it's hugely important.
Well,
Yeah.
thinking of that then, looking forward, I guess, seeing year to you converged year to phone with every awesome tool, what trends or what kind of future initiatives or what things do you see around the corner that you're not really sure, but how do you plan for that, right? Like, how do you both plan to make the pencil do something different in the future while kind of planning for it to be even more because you see it coming? And what trends are there now, like adding haptics, adding how you were saying audio and kind of touch? How do you start planning for these things while understanding still being able to satisfy today and tomorrow at the same time? And which ones do you see coming up soon? Which ones that we don't know of senses that we don't know that we want to kind of take advantage of? How do you even start quantifying that in your process?
I think really, really important is to understand that if you don't engage with something and begin to iterate, iteration is not failure. You have to engage with something, with an idea, try it, iterate, obviously fail, go on to the next thing, iterate, and you begin to build. For us right now, we're really interested in mixed reality, and it's taking some time to really understand how we can use that to communicate what we need to communicate for our clients. But we will push an idea and we'll try it out and it won't work, and then we move on to the next thing. And it's just these sprints. For us, that's how we're going for it.
We're on the precipice of a pretty amazing time, and everybody who's here is here because they're drawn to this vector. But I think that, one of the sound bites I like to use is that, as hard as it is for me to explain to my kids that once upon a time you had to like go into a room in your house to make a phone call with a device tethered to the wall, like they just can't even grok that. It will be way harder for them to explain to their kids that once upon a time all of our digital information was presented to us through these silly rectangular slabs of glass and silicon. Like that will be such a hard concept because we're at this moment in time where the information is quite literally bursting out of the screen and into the world around us. And we have hundreds of millions of years of genetic programming to understand how to communicate and compute in 3D space, not this 50 or 70 year kind of two-dimensional projection of digital information. And we went, Lon and I and Chris went deep on this topic. We kind of went to crazy town on the podcast that we did together on CG Garage on this specific topic. But one thing I would say, just in terms of like the technology vector, is, in the continuum of, the alphabet soup of AR, VR, first of all, it's my belief that it's easy. It's all AR. VR is will just be a feature on the AR contact lenses or eyeglasses of the future. That whether you want to be in the physical space, you want to be teleported to an unbuilt space, that's just like a feature. And in that way, all of VR will be a footnote on the Wikipedia page of this future computing paradigm. And I think that if you factor things forward, think about it. It's, 10 years ago, the iPhone generation is 10 years and change. Fast forward an iPhone and a half forward, 15 years, that's not that long from now, right? And certainly by 20 years, most people that won't have a cell phone, right? And if you want a cell phone-oriented computing paradigm, you'll extend your palm and get a cell phone paradigm. Or if you want a tablet, you just make it bigger or you throw it on the wall and we share it. And that little charrette is like plagued by so much intellectual baggage that we have because we grew up using 2D screens. Like that's the equivalent of the original motion pictures filming people on stage doing a play. Like we will just be able to compute in 3D in such an authentic way. So it's that vision that we stay super disciplined about as interaction designers to understand that is happening the day after tomorrow, and we need to understand that that's the vector that we're on, and everybody in this room is, kind of co-conspirators in that future, and it's, it's an incredibly thrilling time to be alive.
The one thing that I would say about that is that we talk a lot about the immersive experience itself, and I think there's a place for architects to actually kind of play around with, the immersion in the real world as well. And so how do you host, for example, in a museum, how do you host an immersive experience, right? And how do you start to bring the performance outside of the digital space into the physical space? And how do you begin to have, this is kind of your playground, right? And so the architecture could also, heighten its awareness. And as architect, there's a place for making this happen. So last year, with Kaleidoscope VR, I collaborated with two independent artist group, Isaac Cohen and Floatland, and we did a pop-up VR experience, couple of VR experience at SF MoMA, for example, right? Multiplayer experience, and my role was to kind of bridge the moment before, the moment during, and the moment after, and look at, how do you bring, a visitor, any visitor with any kind of knowledge, how do you bring them into the experience without actually creating a black box and a VIP line behind it, which is what's happening right now in the exhibit space, right? To try to see if there's a way to kind of, bridge that kind of boundary between the physical and the digital, where the transition obviously now is a little bit hardcore because you have to actually physically put a headset on your head, but to start to think psychologically in terms of human behavior and social interaction, how you can bring a kind of an immersive kind of interaction to bear with kind of smooth transition between the experience that you have outside in the physical world through your senses and the experience that you have. And so that was, talk about visual clues, artifacts that move in and out from these two worlds. So I think there's a trend now that is kind of really emphasizing the experience as an immersive experience and once you're in the space. And I do believe that there's a place for architects to actually start to talk about, and it will evolve, right? I mean, maybe 20 years from now, the conversation is slightly different because we've moved forward from that. But I think there's a place for us to say, okay, how do you integrate that in an architectural experience as just a transition from a physical space to a digital space? I don't, that's...
I think the hardest thing for us is going to be letting go of the baggage, right? I have a almost 3-year-old, and the idea of screen time comes up quite a bit, right? And when we were kids, we look at like, well, we went outside and we played and all of that, and the kids should go outside and play, and that's absolutely true, right? But we're also living in a new time where there is access to new things, and if we only look back through nostalgic reasons, right, we don't move forward. And the same idea goes for anything that we could think of. I mean, for all intents and purposes, if you have a full immersive experience, whether it's AR with VR as a feature, architecture, we've talked about this in the podcast. I don't need anything in my house anymore. Like, I need a weatherproof box, and I could live wherever I want and see whatever I want at any time that I want, and that takes a lot of mental. That seems scary to us now because we're nostalgic for the way we perceive the world and the way that we've experienced it. But at some time, that becomes that can happen, and I think that is going to be the most difficult thing, because it also means that people's livelihoods and what they not only the things that they derived worth from and value from what they do as a job or work or et cetera, that all changes. We're shaking the Etch-a-Sketch pretty hard on it, and I find that really fascinating. I'm sort of equal parts very excited and kind of trying to get there as fast as I can, and then there's this other half of me that's like, I'm deathly afraid of it because it seems like a brave new world.
But do you think that realistically, within your lifetime, we will get to this utopian place where the world is gray and empty and everything happens in this interface, and that your perception is really kind of an illusion, right? And so I just think baggage is great. Like, I love baggage. I feel that it forces you to kind of rethink the problem with these, again, it's not even a problem. It's just this kind of like challenge of saying, okay, I'm attached to this notion, and I understand my world to be perceived in a certain way. I want to be able to kind of hold on to my chair, and then what happens, and what kind of architectural strategies can we use to like gently nudge or change that perception over time? Now, for sure, our evolution is accelerating at a pace that you are conscious of it now, right? I mean, you actually, between the time you were 5 and the time you were 35, the world has changed quite tremendously. And so I think that kind of like, as human beings on this planet, it's a little bit difficult to adjust. We don't have 5,000 years to kind of get there. But I do think that the baggage is somewhat like a tether to the kind of to some kind of stable real world condition, and then the challenge is how to kind of obfuscate.
Well, what I think is interesting there is maybe it kind of lends into something else, is like who's being educated by the tech, right? Because the way you guys make it sound is like we need to de-educate ourselves to receive it, right? Like, we're kind of used to, you said 50, 60 years of plastic screens, and that changed the way we saw the world, but now we're trying to regress in a certain way. And that your 3-year-old doesn't need to get educated in this tech to use it, right?
I mean, you use a different example, right? She'll be 16 eventually, right?
Sorry.
Will she ever need to learn to drive?
No.
Will she ever need that skill 13 years from now? Like, will you get into an autonomous vehicle at that time, and that's how you get around? Like, that's the kind of baggage that we have to go, well, that could be theoretically, it could be here faster than we know it. Maybe it doesn't happen in our lifetime, but I think we have to think about the building blocks for that, and that's hard. Like, that's really hard, because you go, well, I drove. I mean, there are people that are like, I would never drive an electric car because it needs to smell like gasoline and, you know, be a muscle car, right? Like, there's people that won't let that go.
No, but it is also, you know, a kind of large amount of this Earth population will never get to drive this electric car that we're talking about, right? So there has to be, I mean, you know, are you designing local or are you designing global? And what are the kind of the idealistic future existences that you can imagine in architecture or any other way? That's so interesting. Have you put your daughter in VR yet?
Yes.
Because I've done that to a 3-year-old recently, and it was kind of amazing, right? She didn't even.
I mean, this whole notion of, you know, what do we keep and what do we let go of? This is the vector of technology in the history of humankind. Like, what do we keep and what do we let go of? And it's a very individual thing, right? So some of us choose, like I love an analog watch with actual physical things that move, right? And like, I recognize that there's many life advantages to having a screen on my wrist, but it's just not a thing that I've chosen. And so there's many dimensions of this. Where one end of the spectrum is certainly empty gray boxes, and it's a Black Mirror episode, to your point, because we've let go of all the beautiful textures and surfaces. And then, you know, the other end of the spectrum is that, you know, there certainly are things that we take totally for granted, like flat, you know, screens in our environment, or maybe light switches, which are completely obsolete, you know, if you fast forward 20 years, right? And then there's the axis of you know, socioeconomic influence, where you don't want to have certain people with means have a different reality than people without means. You know, so I mean, look, these are big, hairy, hard problems, which is why there's like not one but 4 different Netflix episodes that are exploring it, right? But it's super rad time to explore it, right? Because we're right on the precipice of all these things happening and asking these exact questions. And there's only one way to answer them, which is, you know, as they say, there's only one way to predict the future, which is go out and invent it and start to build it and find those edges and say, oh, that was bad, let's try this, you know. So anyways, these questions are the ones that we should be asking.
Mm-hmm. I think that if you choose to look at the optimism of what this technology affords, just really to think about how it will improve life, and you just really focus on that, you can already see all these advantages. Autonomous vehicles give more space back to the curb. You have more community space for people to gather. So where technology comes in, you're allowing for more human interaction. In super dense urban environments, you can replace what you would see out your window, which might be the next tenement, with a beautiful image. So you could actually improve the quality of life, give back more time to creativity and human kind of engagement. So I think it's up.
Well, I've never heard Netflix brought up 3 times during a panel about VR. That was impressive on different scales. Well, I think from the museum side, it's interesting because you have to take in all those accounts that you were just bringing up, the kind of cultural, psychological aspect, and then you even said it earlier, erasing the building. And these all become issues that have focal points in our society that we've always used as projection tools to literally project the values and aspects on. And they represent something more. And I think having a medium that is now a manifestation of those issues, it's almost like an artifact of our culture that we kind of put everything into it, and now we're unciphering it to see how we unevolve it into a point where we can now start controlling it, and it's not just something that's being deposited. It becomes an extremely powerful tool, I think, for education on various scales, how we see ourselves, which is a kind of weird reality. Now we actually see the world that we're living in because we have to make it, and we see what kind of baggage we're bringing in or we're leaving out, and that says more about us sometimes than just living in the world that we live in. And I think it's only kind of going to change more and more, specifically in the architectural realm, with schools that are just adopting it without even blinking an eye, versus firms that are obviously investing in it to large scales, to people that tell us what we're allowed to have in our worlds and not, and people that make the worlds more beautiful than we ever living in. So I think it's a really interesting opportunity to see how this is going to go forward, hopefully in our lifetime. That's such a sad thing to say, but I kind of look forward to see how that evolves. And so thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you guys. don't think there's time for questions.
Yeah.
We have time for a question if you can get it out in 32 seconds. Okay. Challenge accepted, I guess.
Nice.
Well, thank you for the very interesting discussion. I'm not in the architecture industry, but I always, admire great architecture. And from what I heard, anyway, is it's much easier to design a great building or a masterpiece architecture than to navigate the regulations and politics and get it approved and get it built. Is there area opportunities here for VR and AR to maybe help that, or maybe what technology that still need to be invented, maybe for that to happen, for more great buildings to get built?
Me.
Okay, the architect.
I have to say that it's something that you navigate on every project. Every project is a series of barriers and things that you have to overcome. I think politically and kind of, I don't know, the aspects that you're talking about, I think for us it becomes kind of a play of information and education, and that doesn't necessarily happen in the professional everyday life, but it's about like a kind of participating to a bunch of public events, evolve ourselves in the actual needs of the city, like LA with the grand challenges, for example. And it's about education, going into the schools and start talking to everybody a little bit more specific about it. It's a very broad question, difficult to answer, but my answer to that in general is that we will just move forward, and if someone has a reservation of questions, it's a discussion that occurs, and it may redirect the final product. I don't know, it's a little bit difficult to answer in terms of the actual practice. I don't know, I'm not doing a good job at this question.
One of the things that it does afford an accessibility to people who might not understand how to read a floor plan or be able to interpret a 2D rendering to know exactly what it's going to be like to be on that street corner when they build something in their neighborhood. At the same time, so that brings a wealth of information that they might not have had, and allows them to understand it at a kind of a more intuitive level. But that also brings up the possibility, right, that now that you have more informed people, maybe there's more objection or a better way to object on it, and which is neither good or bad, but I think it does change the process, and it brings more people into it.
But it's dangerous. It's so dangerous, because before you're even done through the process of designing and kind of massaging this thing to be the best that it can be, we've already shown a 3D immersive, experience 12 months ago. And so, what are you selling, right? Are you selling the idea of architecture? Are you selling these rendered wall and that rendered floor and that light, direction, whatever? So it has a little bit of a dangerous kind of proposal for us. We're very careful how much we reveal and how we reveal it. And I think immersive experience is a tricky situation.
I think there are definitely those cases where you want to kind of retain control of something until it's fully kind of baked, for lack of a better word. But when you're in these situations where you're dealing with communities and you're in a public approvals process, a lot of projects in Los Angeles are going through this, right? Hollywood area, downtown area. You have interested people in the neighborhood who are perhaps reticent about large towers, or maybe concerned about what might happen to their favorite corner of a city. If you're able to engage them in a kind of not a 2D representation of what that future would be, but to actually put them in that area, and for them to realize that it's going to really revitalize the core. Don't worry about these towers, actually they're there, but you'll have this incredible experience. And our experience has been that it's been very, very effective to communicate a really optimistic scenario when that is actually the goal of the architectural design. So it's been great for that, I think.
I think we're going to get kicked off now.
I think so. Any other questions?
Thank you so much
Thank
again,
you.
everyone.
Great.